long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series and beyond. I am your host, constant reader, Scott Daly, and I am tired.
And I'm your co-host, relative king newbie Matt Freeman. And Scott, have you tried slathering your body in peanut butter before getting in bed?
Yes, actually, but not to help me sleep. This week on the show, we begin a brand new novel, Insomnia. We meet on this week's reading Ralph Roberts, the 70-year-old Derry resident and protagonist of this book, who loses his wife to a brain tumor and then shortly after begins to suffer from a little thing called insomnia. Matt, what did you think of the beginning of our second book of the season?
It was very fun. Not what I was expecting. Based on what we talked about last time,
Sure.
what I was expecting was pure madness. So I'm definitely into this story. I think we'll have a lot to say about the interesting ways in which King hooks us and gets our investment, gets our attention, even though this is not sort of what I think of as kind of a typical Stephen King story. Maybe it is. I haven't read that many of them, but it's unique. I think it's unique, and I think we're gonna have a lot of fun talking about it.
Yeah, the first episodes are always some of my favorites, but they're also always the ones that I'm most nervous about because I'm so afraid to lead you in these opening pages to something. Like I could pull something out and say, well, this is clearly the theme of the novel being set up right here, but I don't want to do that. I don't want to declare the theme. So these episodes are always kind of the hardest for me, where I feel like most of what I'm saying is just, here's a summary of what happened. Matt, please react. Go. But I think this book does invite a lot of interesting thoughts. And obviously it opens up what this novel is going to be about. Maybe not thematically, but at least plot wise. And there's some interesting choices that King is making in what he is making this story about that I think it's going to be fun to talk about and maybe try to get to the bottom of.
Yeah. Right off the bat, something I think we're going to talk about a bit today is the fact that Ralph seems to be a very introspective character.
Yeah.
And so along those lines, the sorts of things that he's thinking about strike me as likely going to be the sorts of things that are the themes of the book. So there's not, as you say, there's going to be less sort of having to tease things out because the character is this introspective guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true broadly in King's writing. Not that all his characters are introspective; they don't always aren't. But I think like one thing that I've noticed about and maybe the difference between doing this show and doing the shows before it, that like our conversations analyzing the book are much less about like trying to yank the meaning out of it. I think when King wants you to know what the meaning is, he makes it pretty clear what the meaning of a certain scene or a certain moment are. And that doesn't mean there's not anything to talk about. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about. We've spent hundreds of hours talking about it, but just a little bit different,
Yeah, I get you.
And I really like this book. I don't want to say too much about it here at the beginning, but it's a book I really enjoy. I was very pleasantly surprised to see how many people out there that listen are excited for us to cover this book. Like I've mentioned on the show before, I've been a Stephen King fan for a very long time, but I've never really participated in like a Stephen King community. It was really just like my mom and kind of my dad, except he hates him now, and my cousin and a couple people I knew online. So I've never really like had in-depth long conversations with constant readers. So I never knew like where the books generally stacked up amongst the community. And I was a bit surprised to see, pleasantly surprised to see how many people loved Insomnia and were really excited for us to talk about it. So that makes me happy, and it makes me excited to do this book. I have to say, Matt, I was reading Billy Summers last week, which is Stephen King's brand new novel, came out a couple weeks ago. And I was getting to the point in the week where I was like, okay, I really gotta start Insomnia, because if I don't start Insomnia, I won't have time to prepare in time for our show. And I didn't want to, because I was like in the middle of Billy Summers, and eventually I had to get to a point where I was like, okay, I got to stop. And so my very beginning few, like maybe dozen pages in this book on this reread were kind of frustrated because I really wanted to get back to that other book and finish it. But then King does this thing where he just kind of sucks you in, and suddenly you find yourself like enamored with the characters and what's going on and the mystery, even though you know the answers to all these things. And I very quickly found myself in love with this book again. And then, of course, after I finished the reading, went back and finished Billy Summers, and it was great, and I loved it. And now all is right with the world.
That's funny because I was switching between this book and Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. And man, you want to have some whiplash in terms of storytelling idioms.
Sure.
Man.
Let me guess. People in that novel, did they blush a lot? Did they blush a lot?
There's some blushing. There's some, it's not a bad book, actually. It's just it's a very different speed.
Sure. The funny thing, like every author has their own tics, right? King has his own tics, certainly. The thing about the blushing is I never noticed it until you brought it up one time, and now every time I see it in a Sanderson book, I laugh at it because I'm like, it's because you've drawn my attention to it.
Yeah. Can I say that he's actually gotten better in this book?
Okay, good.
This isn't Sanderson corner, but I'm enjoying this book more than I have some of his other books.
We're not slinging any Sando here. That's not till the end of the month. All right, let's go ahead and move on and get into Insomnia, a book that we're both really excited to talk about. One quick announcement before we get into the book. I know many of you out there, especially the ones that have submitted stories, have been very patiently, and I want to thank you for that, waiting for an update on what's going on with our Do the King Thing contest. Well, we have an update for you. I think we have finally come up with a plan for exactly how we're going to tackle the voting of this thing, and we will be announcing that very shortly. So you're listening to this on Friday, most likely. You might have already heard our plan. We might have already announced it because we're recording this at the very beginning of the week, or it will be any day now. So thank you for your patience this week. I'm saying it here, so we have to stick to it. You'll hear something soon. Thank you again for your patience, everyone. Again, we had to kind of completely redo our plans for how to handle the voting because the response to this thing was so positive and wonderful. So thank you for that, and thank you for your patience.
Yeah, it's been awesome. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right, Matt, let's talk about Stephen King's Insomnia.
Talk to me.
All right, we got to travel back in time once again, Matt. Not back to the 70s, but this time back to the 90s, back 10 years to 1994. Because as everyone knows, the 90s were 10 years ago. All of them, the entire 90s were 10 years ago.
And it'll always be so.
It is true. Yeah, the 80s were 20 years ago. The 90s were 10 years ago. 2005 was about 3 or 4 years ago. And it's still 2020. That's how it all works.
Yep.
In 1994, the number one film of the year was The Lion King. The Billboard Top 10 of the year includes not just one, but 3 songs from the hit band Ace of Base, including the number one song, The Sign, which I'm sure we all know, that wonderful song.
Right. Ace of Base, my favorite.
Wait, you know Ace of Base, right?
I probably do, but I can't think of any of their songs.
You don't know The Sign? I saw the sign and it opened up my eyes, and I am happy now living without you.
Okay.
Oh.
Yep. Okay. Yep.
I can't tell if you recognize that or not. This is really upsetting me.
Yeah, close enough. I mean, look, Scott. I wasn't big into music when I was 9 years old, not living in America.
God. Oh my gosh. The number one rated television show in America, that country you weren't living in, was Seinfeld, with both ER and Home Improvement in a close second and third. Notable events of the year are Tonya Harding's attack on Nancy Kerrigan at the U.S. National Figure Skating Championship, O.J. Simpson leading the world on a high-speed chase in a white Bronco after he totally did not murder his ex-wife and her boyfriend, and perhaps most importantly to us, in June of 1994, the Supreme Court upheld a ruling that said it was illegal for protesters to block access to clinics that provide abortions. We'll get into why that matters in a few minutes here.
Yeah.
On September 15th of this year, Stephen King releases his latest novel, Insomnia, which is going to be the subject of the next 12 episodes of the show. We're going to take 12 episodes to talk about this very big novel. It is a massive book. It has a big, bright red and white cover. In fact, I like you said, we were 9 years old when this book came out. I was not reading Stephen King yet, but I remember this book. I remember my mom getting this book and reading this book because this cover, it's so bright. It's so big. There's nothing on it but words, just says Insomnia and Stephen King in big letters. Whoever designed this cover, pretty brilliant, because it just catches your eye, that's for sure.
It is a great cover, I have to say. In fact, one of the things that's made me curious about this book is like, why the cover? It's such a evocative cover. Love it.
This, Matt, is Stephen King's 28th novel, if you count the Bachman books. And to put things in perspective, this book was released 3 years after Dark Tower Book 3, The Wastelands, and 3 years before Dark Tower Book 4, Wizard and Glass. So while King is in the process of writing this novel, Insomnia, Roland's backstory in Magus is nothing but an idea in his head, and the events of the final 3 novels of the tale probably haven't even been fully formed yet, certainly not in the way we end up seeing them.
Yeah, so we're in a certain sense at maybe some kind of crossroads of crossroads is the word I was looking for. Crossroads in the Dark Tower, and it'll be really interesting to see how this fits into that space.
Yeah, absolutely. And related to that, why are we reading this book for season 2? Well, there's a couple reasons, at least a couple reasons that we know about. The first and foremost is the most directly is that there is a character in the Dark Tower Book 7 called Patrick Danville, who ends up being a pretty instrumental character in the outcome of that particular story. And as we understand it, as we have been told by the Dark Tower, Patrick Danville is found somewhere in the pages of this very book, Insomnia.
Mm-hmm.
But more than that, Insomnia is the book that the Tet Corporation gives Roland as he journeyed back to Midworld after saving both the Tower and Stephen King. This is the book that they told him to read, and he decided to throw out without reading, feeling like it was going to be a trap. And I don't think that story ever really answered the why of that question. Why was he given this book? Why did he feel like it was a trap and throw it out? And I guess what we can do is maybe as we're reading this story, try to get to the bottom of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that makes me curious to read this book, obviously. And I mean, I kind of want to wildly theorize, actually.
Sure.
Just like it's kind of from the place of knowing very little about Insomnia. What if, King, while writing Insomnia, put in a bunch of Dark Tower clues and references, and then later changed his mind about the direction of the Dark Tower, such that the clues that he put into Insomnia, or the references that he put into Insomnia, no longer really make sense or cohere with things. And then if Roland were to read that book, then it would basically serve as misdirection to him, because it's like, well, that's not actually what King decided to do. This is this is a prediction that I make purely on the basis of knowing when he wrote this book. But it sounds plausible to me, at least.
Yeah, I like that theory a lot, especially considering how much we know about how the final 3 books of this series circle around an event that hasn't even happened in his life when he's writing this novel, right? So he changed as a person. He had a very traumatic thing happen to him, and he used that event to change this big ongoing story. So yeah, a book that he wrote 5 years before that event happened might have thought that the Dark Tower was going to a different direction, a different place, a different meaning, a different theme. And yeah, I mean, I think that's a really wonderful theory, and let's keep that in mind as we go through this book.
All right.
Another thing I want us to keep in mind as we go through this book is that Insomnia is one of the few remaining Stephen King books that have never gotten an adaptation of any kind. No movie, no TV miniseries, not even a cheap throwaway thing, nothing. There's nothing that exists of this book. So that's a question we might want to ask ourselves as we go. Why not?
Yeah, it's fascinating. They're about to make a Chapel-weight TV series.
Yeah.
and then there's no Insomnia movie. Yeah. I mean, I have no clue at this point, obviously.
Yeah. Well, we'll return to that several times throughout the book and see if we can get to the bottom of it.
All right.
Let's begin our talk of the book proper, and we begin in the book's prologue. Yeah, prologue. This prologue is called Winding the Death Watch 1. And as we mentioned last week, our prologue has that title. What I did not mention last week, though, Matt, was the 1 at the end of it, which is I guess pretty ominous, right?
I mean, in a Stephen King book, you're gonna get more than one Death Watch, though.
Sure. I do think like King has kind of taught us throughout every book we've read, where if a chapter starts with a number in it, it usually means that we're going to return to that same title. Like he did that. That was his whole thing in Salem's Lot, right? If there was a chapter, if the Mark chapter had a 1 next to it, it means you were getting a second Mark chapter. If it didn't, it means you weren't. And so here we have to assume that this means we're going to get at least 1 more chapter with the title Winding the Death Watch.
You are correct.
Yeah. So in classic King fashion, the prologue opens with a quote. This one, I don't think we're going to have to put our poetic analysis hats on to analyze. It's going to be pretty easy. This is from the Ecuadorian author Juan Montalvo, who says, "Old age is an island surrounded by death." So this is obviously here because the protagonist of Insomnia, Ralph Roberts, is an old man. He's 69 years old in the prologue and 70 years old by the time the book properly starts in chapter 1. And his age will indeed be a big part of what this book is about. Not just his age, but the age of those around him, and especially that of his wife, who we will very quickly learn is dying. The death watch is for her. So it's interesting, King would choose to write about an elderly man at this point in his life.
It is, because he's only about 47 while writing this book. And I get that 47 probably feels old if you're 47, but I mean, like 35 also kind of feels old. So,
oh God, yes, it does.
So and 47 is still pretty far away from 70, which is, the age of the character. So like, I don't necessarily think that we can just simply say, oh, Stephen King is writing about being old because he feels old. It's like, I don't know. I've written I think when I was in my 20s, I wrote one elderly character. Like sometimes an elderly character is just a fit with what's on your mind, with what the theme is, with what the story is that you have in mind. So I don't, for whatever reason, I actually don't want to just jump to like, oh, it's because Stephen King is feeling old. I think there's I think that there's probably going to be some other reason behind the choice that's going to become more clear as we go.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the easiest thing to grab for is like, oh, 47, that's midlife crisis time. And maybe someone in their midlife crisis is thinking about age a lot. And so what's going to be thinking about what's it going to be like to be 70.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, I mean, I think there's more going on than that. And I think we need to get further into the book before we really conclude on that in any way. But
yeah, I guess I'd just add, old age is an island surrounded by death, just to fixate on the word island. That speaks of loneliness, like you're all by yourself and you're surrounded by death. And loneliness is actually an emerging idea, an emerging theme in the story that we're going to talk about today. So, possibly it's like the core theme might be something closer to loneliness, and that old age is just kind of one way that you can approach the idea of loneliness.
Yeah. I mean, certainly through his insomnia, it's isolating, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of isolation and loneliness that Ralph was feeling at the start of this book, for sure.
Right.
The book itself starts on, I love this opening sentence. I think it just sets an incredible tone right off the bat. No one, least of all Dr. Litchfield, came right out and told Ralph Roberts that his wife was going to die. But there came a time when Ralph understood without needing to be told. I just like, that's a hell of a first sentence, right?
Yeah, it's great. Also, this is something I just got to get out of the way now. Isn't Litchfield basically like a word that means graveyard?
Yeah, I mean, I've never actually thought about that word, but yes.
There we go.
It's a lich. It's a field of liches.
It's a field of liches. I mean, I think I've heard the word lich used to refer to like corpses, not just, undead things. Mm-hmm. So anyway.
Litchfield word origin. Let's do it.
Yeah.
We're doing it.
Okay.
Oh, it means gray wood.
Uh-huh. Sure it does, Scott. That sounds
no. The original modern name, it's twofold. Popular etymology has it that thousands of Christians were martyred in Lichfield around AD 300 during the reign of Diocletian, and the name Lichfield actually means field of the dead. So there you go.
Field of the dead. There you go.
There you go. There you go.
And I'm sure Stephen King either knew that or was leaning on the connotation of the word lich. Either way.
Of course. Yeah, it's so funny. Like, I know I play too many video games to not know what a lich is, but that like never occurred to me. I never like looked at the name that way. That's great. This is why it's so fun to do this with you, because you approach these things from just a different enough angle that you find fun stuff like this.
Yeah, and also just like when you're staring at words, you're like, wait a second. So yeah, all right.
By the way, that was a myth and didn't actually happen. So
the Christians being massacred thing?
Yes,
okay.
yes.
All right.
There's no evidence to support that's the actual origin of the word, but it is now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So as we said, yeah, it seems, Matt, that the Death Watch in the prologue is not for our main character, as you predicted last week, but sadly for his wife. And for those of you scoring at home, that's 2 season 2 books, 2 dead wives. So what are these books written by Christopher Nolan or something?
Hey. I love that King's first beta reader is usually his wife. You can just imagine her like reading the book and looking up at him. You know,
yeah.
You trying to say something, baby? Huh?
Yeah, God, if that's what she's gonna say to him as she beta reads his book, like she's gonna say that so many times to her husband. Oh my God.
Yeah, this is leaving aside the books where the main character is an author who murders his wife with a shovel.
In all seriousness, though, I do think it's clear, you know, in both of the books we've covered in this season so far, and Stephen King in general, some of the other Dark Tower books, other books that I know you've read, I think it's clear that King really loves to enter the lives of his characters in the midst of grief from some kind of profound loss or tragedy. This is a thing he really likes to do. He does it again and again and again. And I think it's just because what better time to put a character on like a journey of self-discovery or to learn something or to change and grow than the moment right after their entire world has kind of been turned completely upside down. It is a moment of, losing a loved one is a moment of great turbulent change, and it's just a very dynamic, it seems like a cruel word to say, but these aren't real people, so it's fine. It's a dynamic time to enter the life of a character.
Yeah, sure, that makes sense. I think you're right.
And one thing I do appreciate about this prologue, and yes, I do like this prologue, me the hater of prologues, I do enjoy this one, is it allows us to get a glimpse of Ralph not in the midst of his grief as we'll see him in chapter 1, but rather from the perspective of kind of slowly watching it approach him on the horizon.
Sure. Hey, why do you think you don't mind this prologue?
I think I'm trying to think of a way that make sure I'm not spoiling anything for the rest of the book, but I think it's because it feels like a completely contained story that by the end of this week's reading, we will kind of see how the contained story relates to the rest. But I do think it is because we get a glimpse of Ralph pre-death of his wife and pre-Insomnia, and it's a glimpse of who this man was before all these events started happening to him. And I think that's important for getting your hooks into who he is as a person, not just as a widower and an insomniac, but as just a human being. And we see kind of some of the traits of him that we're going to see throughout the other 2 chapters. We kind of define them in this prologue, and that allows us to see them as traits of the character and not results of the things that have happened to him.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. I mean, I was imagining if you were to do this as a film, then you would do, this bit, and then there would be like a, 1 year later title card.
Sure.
And it's like just clearly this is structurally separated from the rest of the book in a way that, it's like, okay, well, you might as well use a prologue for it and not just call it chapter 1. So
yeah, what I would do, those of you wanting to adapt Insomnia, since no one's done it yet, is you would definitely have him wake up at 4:15, almost as if the events of the prologue were just a dream or a memory in his head, that he's remembering this day or something. And then he wakes up and it's 4:15 and he's like, fuck.
There you go.
Boom. Why haven't we made this movie yet, Matt? Let's make it, you and me.
I don't know. Is this on that dollar baby list?
No, it's not. It's usually just his short films and stuff that are on there.
All right.
But the other thing I want to point out here with this ticking clock that we're talking about here, notice how Ralph's insomnia, as we're going to learn in the next chapter, is kind of its own ticking clock, that each day he wakes up earlier and earlier and earlier, is similar to Caroline's ticking clock here, her ticking death clock, where each day the amount of time she has left is ticking down and down and down. And I really think that's a really great comparison. And I think that's probably part of the reason why the particular brand of insomnia that he has manifests the way it does.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's a sort of subconscious parallel between, the slow, inexorable approach of death and the slow, inexorable loss of his ability to sleep. I like that.
Definitely.
Cool.
And then I just want to read this because I love this writing. Those 4 months were like being dragged drunk through some malign carnival where the people on the rides were really screaming. The people lost in the mirror maze were really lost. And the denizens of Freak Alley looked at you with false smiles on their lips and terror in their eyes. Ralph began to see those things by the middle of May. And as June set in, he began to understand that the pitchmen along the medical midway had only quack remedies to sell, and that the cheery quick step of the calliope could no longer quite hide the fact that the tune spilling out of the loudspeakers was the funeral march. It was a carnival, all right. The carnival of lost souls. I just love that imagery, right? This idea that, like, where does that metaphor come from, that those 4 months are being like a carnival where everyone's terrified and miserable?
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. I love it. I mean, that's not too dissimilar from the tone that kind of pervades the whole prologue. And that's one thing I want to talk about regarding the prologue, is the fact that it's like this very internal writing. Generally, there's a lot of microscopic looks into Ralph's thought processes and reasoning. Like, and this isn't a negative criticism, it's just pointing out that, like, not much really happens. Like, there's a car crash that he witnesses and some yelling, and he walks a lot, and he thinks a lot about his wife. Like, and I'm not complaining at all. I actually love it. I'm just emphasizing how much of the prologue is actually just getting the feel of knocking around inside Ralph's head with paragraphs like this.
Sure. Yeah. The beautiful. I love the thing that I immediately compared to this with, like, the false smiles and the people that are screaming, but not screaming out of happiness, but screaming out of terror, is the Charlie the Choo Choo book.
Yeah.
And this idea that, like, there's these people that are supposed to be happy and supposed to be having a great time, but you look at them a little more closely and no, it's real terror. No, it's real fear. No, it's everyone's putting on a smiling face. And it's like this idea that you're seeing the world the way everyone else sees it, but you can see underneath it's a very thin veneer, and underneath it, it's terror and fear and death. And that it's wonderful.
Yeah. I love
it so much. So Ralph deals with this 4-month carnival ride by running away from it, or, well, walking away from it. He goes on these marathon walking sessions all around the town of Derry, which, speaking of which, Matt, this book is set in the town of Derry, which makes this your first Derry, Maine book, right, Matt?
Oh boy, yeah.
Welcome to Derry.
I'm so happy.
I love this section here. He walked over much of Derry that hot July, a narrow-shouldered old man with thinning white hair and big hands that still looked capable of hard work. He walked from Witcham Street to the Barrens, from Kansas Street to Neibolt Street, from Main Street to the Kissing Bridge, but his feet took him most frequently west along Harris Avenue, where the still beautiful and much beloved Carolyn Roberts was now spending her last year in a haze of headaches and morphine, to the Harris Avenue Extension and Derry County Airport. So this is, I think, just a fun treat for those who have read other King stories set in Derry, most notably It. Like, a lot of those streets I just read to you are very notorious and known locations from those other stories. And so if you have read It and are coming in to read this book and see it set in Derry, you're like, I know Neibolt Street. I know what the Barrens are. I know what the Kissing Bridge is. In fact, the 1 Mile Hill later in the book is also a very well-known location. It's just, it's fun for me and for the people that have read these other stories. And for you, it's just harmless backdrop setting of where the book is.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's very fun. This is the benefit of not burning your town to the ground at the end of the book. It's a lesson he learned after Salem's Lot. You can keep coming back to it. Actually, this did make me wonder whether Salem's Lot is on the same level of the tower as Derry is. And I would actually guess no, it isn't.
Oh, interesting.
I don't know if we know for sure, but...
I mean, you don't. So...
Yeah. There we go.
So on one of his walks, Ralph kind of zones out a little bit and walks way further out to the Derry airport than he intended to, and has a chance encounter with a man that lives down the street from him. This is a man named Ed Deepnow. Hey, wait a minute.
Hey.
We know that last name, don't we?
We do.
Yeah, this is our old pal Aaron Deepnow from the Dark Tower. So we don't actually know if Ed is related to him in any way, but it's a name that's familiar, and so we have to at least point it out.
Yeah. I feel like there was another Deep Now somewhere. Actually, no, or maybe not. Whatever. Let's move on.
Maybe get to it.
Okay.
Before we get to the Deep Now encounter itself, I just wanted to highlight the atmosphere of this entire scene going on here, right? You've already kind of touched on this, but like there's these dark purple thunderstorm clouds on the horizon. Ralph knows that his sick and dying wife is at home waiting for him, and he's walked too far. The rain is going to be coming any moment. And of course, the ticking tick of that death clock is there, and all of this kind of compounds to result in this ominous propulsion that this entire scene contains within it.
Yeah, I absolutely love the atmospheric just vibe, just the throbbing of it. It was funny because I was actually listening to this while on one of my long walks through my town, which, as you'll recall, is called Castle Rock.
Yes, I don't know if all our listeners knew that.
Yeah,
Matt lives in Castle Rock.
It's been a while since I mentioned that. But yeah, it made me really kind of like physically vibe with the scene, and it made it really powerful.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, I don't know, I think anyone that walks a lot has had the moment where they just kind of zone out and realize they've walked way further than they intended to, and now they have a way further way back to walk. And I love that Ralph, in this moment of, you know, realizing he's walked out this far, like considers walking up to the Howard Johnsons at the airport and hailing a cab and just being able to take a cab home to get back before it rains, to get back to his sick wife, and to get back because he's fucking tired because he's an old man that just walked like 5 miles. Right. But he chooses not to do this. And the reason he gives for choosing not to do this is this idea that the cabbie would judge him, that he'd get in the back of the cab and the guy in the front seat would look in the mirror and his eyes would say, "Oh, stupid old man that walked too far and is now too tired to walk back." And this, I think, is a really important characteristic of Ralph that we establish right here. He's very much a stubborn man. He's very much a man that is not ready to be old yet. I love, you know, we kind of just yada yada by it, but in his Walking Over Derry, the description of him included big hands that still looked capable of hard work. And the interesting thing about this book, it's a very, very close third person point of view, right? Like we'll talk about moments in which the narrator kind of interjects, but we're almost constantly, as you said, in Ralph's head throughout this book. Yeah. And it's not first person, but that feels like a Ralph kind of interjecting into the narration a bit there, and whose hands are still capable of work. Like, we don't know the full story of Ralph's retirement yet, but we do know, like, he just doesn't seem like the type of guy that's ready to be called old yet.
Yeah, this does seem to be an emerging thread that we see throughout this week's reading.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Ralph sees Ed Deep Now coming out of the general aviation terminal, which he notes is weird because you need like a key card to get back there. And he's a research assistant. He doesn't have anything to do with aviation, and he shouldn't have a key card. So there's just another little seed of mystery that King has planted for us. But he's acting kind of weird and erratic. He barely stops in time to let the gate open. He's screaming profanities out of his car as he does that. He then drives past the gate and ends up running into a truck out on the road, and boom, we've got an accident. And Ed, in a total rage, immediately starts trying to pick a fight with the extremely large man driving the truck that he ran into. But fortunately, Ralph interjects in time. Ralph, our hero, kind of sprints over there as fast as his old man legs can take him to kind of get in there. Yeah.
It's a great hook, right? You're like, what the hell's happening? You know, and yeah, as Ed proceeds to just like really not act like himself, he's basically acting psychotic and like rabid. It's like unnerving. It's tapping into what I see as like maybe a kind of generic fear of like a person that, you know, not behaving like themselves.
Yeah.
Which is not a fear that you see tapped into very often, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I love that, because King makes it very clear here that Ralph knows Ed fairly well, and he's this is the exact opposite of the person he is, right? Like when he says, when he first gets a look at him, Ralph had the momentarily but unforgettable impression that this was exactly what he was looking into, an oven. He says he had never seen such utter unreasoning fury in a pair of human eyes, had never even suspected such fury might exist. That's the level at which Ed is unhinged here. Like that he never suspected such anger could even exist when looking into this guy's eyes.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Again, you're just like, man, okay, this is interesting. Like this is a mystery. Where are we going?
Yeah, and there's a lot of weird stuff that's happening in this, and I think this is kind of the interesting part about this prologue is, we've talked about prologues that are setting up stories and introducing questions and kind of confusing us. I think the stuff that confuses us here is almost like, well, what the hell does that mean? Because Ed is suddenly convinced that this random stranger in this truck is a baby murderer, and that his truck bed is filled with the bodies of murdered babies. And he says this, "Ask him what he's got under the tarp," Ed yelled suddenly and pointed over Ralph's shoulder. Lightning flashed, and for a moment the pitted scars of Ed's adolescent acne were thrown into sharp relief like some strange organic treasure map. Which, time out, but fucking Stephen King's so good at what he does.
So good.
Thunder rolled. "Hey, hey, Susan Day," he chanted in a high childlike voice that made Ralph's forearms break out in goosebumps. "How many kids did you kill today?" So it's already weird, right? He's acting psychotic. He's acting unhuman, basically, we're told. And then he starts chanting a thing that he starts talking about dead babies and chanting this thing. And I mean, we will understand kind of the origin of at least the chant and what he's talking about by the end of this week's reading, but that's basically it, right? We don't understand why this is suddenly Ed's "I'm going to drive me up the wall" hot button issue.
Yeah, why this is a thing that he cares about specifically, and also like why he's deciding that this guy that he actually just randomly ran into must have dead babies in his trunk. Like it does seem to be basically, I mean, okay, so Stephen King, so there's probably going to be something like fantastic and supernatural going on.
Mm-hmm.
But like, this just seems like he's just having like a psychotic break, and he's like just connecting random ideas together. Like,
sure,
like he's in a state of high agitation because of something. He gets into a car accident, and then he's just like basically making random associations of just like, oh, I must have hit this guy's car because he has dead babies in the trunk. Like, like that seems like a sort of actually realistic leap of logic for a person to make when they're having like a meltdown.
And to your point, like the moment the character gets to look in the truck bed, open the barrels of fertilizer, and like dig his hand in there and see that there are no dead babies in there, he seems to break out of it at least and go, okay, so I was wrong. Okay.
Yeah.
And kind of reverts back to his previous self.
He reverts back in a way that's almost equally creepy because it's like he so quickly goes back to his normal self, and his normal self seems like just such a like laid back guy that you're
I mean that's the way Ralph describes him, as like a chill, laid back dude that he's never seen have much any emotion, let alone fury.
Right. So it all adds up to making you kind of maybe have some suspicions in a certain direction, but you're like, yeah, but like it's going to be more complicated than that. We're missing something.
Sure. And another weird thing that happens in this scene that I think is worth drawing out because it seems like such a random non sequitur that it almost makes you want to pay attention to it is that while Ralph is trying to deal with the situation, this 90-year-old man named Dorrance, who hangs out at the little park by the extension where like we're told that this is like at the nighttime, this is where all the teens hang out, but in the daytime, this is where all the old people gather to hang out and play cards or chess or just chill. And so this man named Dorrance comes out and he's saying some weird stuff too. So he looks at Ralph and says, "Ralph," Dorrance asked in that same calm but worried voice, "I wouldn't touch him anymore if I were you. I can't see your hands." And so we're like, what? What? We also see that Ed is wearing a red scarf with Chinese symbols on it, which is, we're told, unusual, and that Ed doesn't wear such things normally. And also it's July and it's really hot. And so wearing a scarf does just not make any sense. I'm not like, let me make it clear, I'm not like calling these things out because you need to have a conclusion on what they all mean, but it just seems like the book is making you want to pay specific attention to these things. Right. Am I wrong there?
No, I mean, it's a red scarf. I immediately think about Crimson King iconography, and just the red symbol, right? I think we've actually noticed that King was using red and pink as symbols literally back as far as actually, as far as Carrie.
Yes.
So definitely worth it to pay attention when he makes something red or pink for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, you're pointing all this stuff out, and like I'm not gonna piece it together. Obviously,
Sure.
I do not have a single clue as to like what this is going to add up to. But like, yeah, absolutely, King wants us to be paying attention.
Yeah, I mean, the scarf especially, I think like he points it out multiple times when when Ralph is in the laundromat truck driving home. He draws one of the Chinese symbols on the windshield, and so like Stephen King could basically like write in the liner notes, pay attention to this, and he would make it less obvious than it already is.
Right.
So
I mean, I'm now wondering if the quote unquote Chinese symbol isn't the Crimson King's eye, and not a Chinese symbol at all. Because
I mean that's interesting because if you are reading the audiobook, which we should say for
Correct.
those that do not know that already, the symbol is written in the book itself.
Okay. Okay. And does it? I mean, it's not. I guess you would tell me if it was the Crimson King's eye. So,
I mean, what I might not.
I mean, okay. Do I need to look at the book? God damn it. Okay, I'll look at the book.
You don't have to do it like right now.
I'm not going to look at the book right now. I'll look at the book later.
It looks like okay. I'll stop being coy. It looks like a Chinese symbol. It does not look like it does not look like the eye of the Crimson King that we have, like the symbol that we have come to understand as the symbol of the Crimson King. No, it looks like some Chinese symbol.
Looks like some Chinese symbol, which okay, all right. I'll look at it anyway, just in case I want to read into what it looks like or something.
This is a total segue, but how have you enjoyed the audiobook so far? Because we actually got several messages and emails and DMs from people who have been listening to the audiobook and they did not like the Insomnia audiobook. I guess they made some choices to mix in music at weird parts.
Kind of randomly, kind of like totally randomly. So I like the audiobook reader actually, but then you'll get like creepy music mixed in and it's too loud. And there was one point in particular where it's almost just like a cacophonous violin sting that just like assaults you out of nowhere. And it's like, it's not even like a moment that really calls for it in the story. I think what it was is it was like, the end of chapter 1 and moving into chapter 2 or something like that. But it was just so, it was jarring and unpleasant. But aside from the music, I actually really like what the audiobook reader is doing with the character and the voices, and it's
awesome.
Quite pleasant. I mean, yeah, the music is very distracting, but audiobook reader is doing a great job. So.
I will say one of the hardest things of audio editing that I've had to deal with is making sure levels of spoken to music are good, because like I think this thing happens where if the words are being said, you can always hear it more clearly than a person who doesn't. And like I don't know, I've always struggled with this, and my trick now whenever mixing those two things together is just make the music way lower volume than you think it needs to be, because I don't know, it just like whatever's going on in your head when you're mixing the two things together, it needs to be quieter than you think it does.
I have also leaned in that direction for what it's worth. Yeah.
It's just wild.
Yeah. Before we move on from the scene, though, I wanted to mention like the bit where Dorrance looks at Ralph and can't see his hands. I mean, that reminds me of, something like the touch or maybe some other power, which is kind of showing us like, okay, Deep No has some kind of supernatural affliction, which is maybe like transferred to Ralph when he touched him. Or something, right? It's like, I don't know, something supernatural is going on here.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we are in a Stephen King book, so you wouldn't be crazy for leaping to that kind of assumption.
Cool.
Certainly.
Right.
All right. So eventually, as we said, the truck driver complies and allows Ed to look into the barrels of fertilizer that are in the back of a truck. And once he's convinced that there are no babies in there, he kind of immediately reverts to a version of himself that Ralph recognized. He becomes the Ed that Ralph knows. And so the two men work out a deal regarding their damage and go their separate ways. I don't know about you. Like this is a thing that only King would do. Like any other writer writes a scene that like Ed reverts back and then they just work out the damage, but then like King goes the extra step to characterize the other driver as a guy who has had a DUI and says he has a probationary license and is just bullshitting. He doesn't have a license. And so the reason he wants to get this thing all dealt with without involving insurance is because he doesn't want to get busted either. And he was actually like totally enamored by the landing plane and wasn't paying attention to the road. Like, it's just all these details like that seem completely superfluous, but I don't know. Like, it's just a King thing. And I love them all.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I kind of read it all as being like there's a bunch of off stuff that's happening in this scene, and like Ralph is picking up on it. So it's like, okay, it's like a weird coincidence that this guy was here, and a weird coincidence that he was looking at the plane, and a weird coincidence that Ralph happened to zone out and walk way farther than he usually does, and like just like an unlikely confluence of bizarre, unlucky things happening all together, which again draws your mind in the direction of like something supernatural has kind of maybe not literally orchestrated this event, but influenced this situation in a negative way.
So are we gonna say it's Ka?
I mean, I think yes, but who's Ka?
That is true. So you think so okay, just to kind of circle back around to what you said, like everything that's happening here is being influenced by a negative force,
or I mean it could be that the fact that Ralph was here stopped something much worse from happening, so that could have been a positive force, right? But it seems like it just seems like a very weird surreal scene where it's like some malign presence is reaching out and sort of caused all these bad things to happen at once.
Okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, Dorrance is here as well. Like, yeah, there's just a lot of things happening all at the same time.
Yes.
Sure.
It's very chaotic in a way that's intriguing, and makes you want to figure out what's going on.
Cool. All right. So Ralph finally gets back home, and this is where he finds his wife collapsed on the floor, having had a seizure. Their duplex neighbor, a man named Bill McGovern, who one of his most defining characteristics early in the story is that he has a Panama hat that he's always wearing.
Uh-huh.
He was fortunately there and heard her fall, so he went to take care of her, but he's not really doing anything. He's just kind of freaking out.
Right.
And so Ralph shows up and dials 911 and takes Carolyn to the hospital. That's interesting, right? Like, it's lucky Bill's there, but he doesn't do anything.
Right. He doesn't even dial 911. So it's like, oh, she's having a seizure.
Yeah. It's very fortuitous you were here to not do anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't have a very positive impression of this character from this point. So.
Interesting. Okay. What about his Panama hat?
Suspicious.
Why?
And then it's mysteriously missing later.
Wow. Okay, you're going a little chocolate with that, I think.
Look, I think we've now established a pattern that the beginning of every book is a time of great chocolate for me.
That's true.
Because I have so little data to go on that I'm drawing the shape of a unicorn through like 4 points, four data points. So yeah. Bill McGovern is probably a villain.
It is true that a lot of villains have worn Panama hats.
Yep.
But
Yep.
I think it's too early to come to that conclusion. But okay.
Okay, if you say so.
So they take Carolyn to the hospital and she recovers. But of course, the doctor kind of indicates that this is just the first of many problems that are going to keep getting worse and worse and worse until she eventually passes away. The Death Watch is back. And so we kind of end the prologue on this right here. It was a long while before he thought of Ed Deepnow again, even after he began to see the bruises on Helen Deepnow's face. It was a long time before he thought of Ed again. As the summer became fall, and as that fall darkened towards Carolyn's final winter, Ralph's thoughts were occupied more and more by the Death Watch, which seemed to tick louder and louder even as it slowed down. But he had no trouble sleeping. That came later.
Great hook.
It is. So yeah, I mean, like this is how the prologue ends. So what are your overall thoughts on this prologue, Matt, before we move into the rest of the book?
Well, in some ways it is distinctly King, but in other ways it feels like a totally different author from the guy who wrote Salem's Lot, which is obviously what we, just finished reading. I think some of it is just pure growth and skill from time and experience, but some of it is obviously choiceful changes based on the character voice and the kind of story that he's telling here. And I think most of all, what I'll say is that I'm hooked by the mystery of, what the heck's going on with Deepno and what's going to happen to poor Ralph and where is this going to go? Like I'm already even just after the prologue, before we get to the next chapter, I'm already hooked. I'm already invested in Ralph.
Yeah, I like it. And I like what you said about King's writing. I mean, it has been 19 years since Salem's Lot. So he's changed a lot in that amount of time.
Yep.
Isn't that funny that it's been 19? Everything's 19.
Yep.
But I think the 90s are such an interesting time for King. And I think it's fortunate that one of the only other King books you had read before this whole thing was a 90s King book. Needful Things, I think, was 91. I'm not sure on that. But the 90s are such an interesting King time. And some of my favorite books are in that time. But he's doing a lot of things. And he's exploring weird stuff. And I don't know. I like 90s King a lot. I like the way he writes.
Yeah. It's he's, as you said, this is between, this is kind of in the middle of the Dark Tower.
Yeah. Which
interestingly, in my mind, kind of marks the pivot point between fun, wild adventure Dark Tower and like more serious kind of, deeply, kind of dramatic and tragic Dark Tower.
Yeah, I mean, Wizard and Glass is certainly the latter for sure.
Yes, right. And it's got some fun bits in there, like when they, all of the, all the bits where they have to blow away a bunch of bad guys with their gunslinger skills are pretty awesome. But like, yeah, it's a very tragic story. So, yeah, it's a transitional period for our dear Stephen.
Sure. So before we move on to chapter 1, I just want to say that Insomnia, just like Salem's Lot, is divided into 3 different parts. And our first part is titled Little Bald Doctors. And I'm bringing this up just so I can ask you, Matt, what's your reaction to the title Little Bald Doctors?
Well, the first thing I thought of was the Little Doctors from Little Sisters of Illyria, the short story, which was published in 1998. So after this...
The bugs?
The bugs. Yeah. The little flesh knitting vampire bugs.
Yeah. Which were, of course, described as being bald.
Well, I think the vampire women were actually probably bald. So,
okay.
I mean, look, you asked me what came to mind. What came to mind was the vampire nun doctors and their vampire bugs in Little Sisters of Illyria.
Fair.
What else? I mean, it could obviously be much more literal and boring reference. maybe he's going to go see some doctors and they're going to be bald and diminutive. I don't know, man. I'm just telling you what I thought of.
Sure. Well, perhaps we will find out.
Okay.
Let's begin chapter 1. And this chapter picks up with Ralph after the death of his wife. It's 1 year later. It's July of 93, I believe. And we learn here, we kind of go through what Ralph's life has been like since Carolyn died. We see that a month after she did, he begins to develop our titular insomnia. Though, as we said, it's not the usual kind of insomnia. Ralph has no problem going to bed at night. He just wakes up early and earlier and earlier. Like by July, 1 year after we met him, he's waking up by 4 a.m. and it's only getting worse from there. It's a ticking clock, like we said. So what did you make of this particular brand of insomnia?
Well, it's a fascinating story hook yet again, and another fun little mystery because, everybody gets insomnia sometimes. I think I've had it, a few spells of it in my life, I think, but I've never heard of insomnia that makes you wake up progressively earlier and earlier. And I mean, maybe that's a thing that exists. I've never heard of it. So this is another hook that makes you ask, like, okay, what's going on here? Like, and so you turn the page, you're trying to figure out, you're trying to learn. I kind of wonder if King didn't think to himself, I'm writing a book about an old man whose wife is dying, and we're evidently going to take some time to get to like the heart of the premise and the conflict in the story. So we'd better put some of these hooks in at the start of the book to get people into it. I'm just imagining, the mind of someone who's really good at storytelling, wanting to tell a story that might take some time to kind of get revved up and kind of planting these clever, subtle, more subtle mysteries, right? Because like, sure. I don't know, like, I don't know if I'm being clear here, but like the mystery of like why the old man can't sleep is qualitatively different from the mystery of why they're gonna have a coffin moved into town or whatever in Salem's Lot or something. I don't know. Like I'm trying to like it's a much more mundane sort of thing, but he still successfully hooks you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it is because it's this very interesting, different kind of insomnia. Like, because it's not just, oh, he can't sleep. It seems specific and acute and focused in that it's like a clock. It's just, he's getting up earlier every day. And like clockwork, like it's designed that way. Like, right. It's like it's not that this isn't just some obscure thing. And as we'll see when he uses some of his remedies to try to fix it, it seems otherworldly in a lot of ways. Yeah. And that does kind of hook you in a little bit.
Exactly. The process of him doing his experiments is extremely fun. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I said last week that Ralph was one of my favorite Stephen King protagonists, and he is. And it's because he's this incredibly kind man, as we'll touch on all the way through this book. But also it's because he's incredibly stubborn. And we see here at the very beginning of the book, he says he hasn't gone to the doctor to check out his insomnia yet because he hates the doctor. He hates Field of Corpses doctor. And he blames him actually for the misdiagnosis of his wife. Like, I love this line here. Except Ralph had made it his business to get a good look into Litchfield's eyes on the few occasions he had seen him between Carolyn's first convulsions last July and her death this March. And Ralph thought what he'd seen in those eyes was a mixture of unease and guilt. It was the look of a man trying very hard to forget he has fucked up. And I love this because not only does Ralph know that the other doctor probably would have said it was too late to stop it anyway, like once she had the headaches, it was too late. He also knows or admits later in chapter 2 that he probably is misremembering this moment and putting this look into the doctor's eyes himself because he wants someone to blame for this whole thing. Right. And this is what you're going back to. Like, this is a protagonist that's very aware of himself and very aware, internally aware of what he's doing.
Exactly. This is a very fun thing about having an old, mature protagonist is that he can't really bullshit himself very effectively. And I think one of the consequences is it does end up being a more internal story because he's not typically going to act, reactively. He's going to think things through and, often have a nuanced reaction to things, which just it simply takes more time to express the thought process of someone who is thinking through things in a more mature and slow paced way. Of course, one thing we do with this character is as the chapter goes, as the story goes on, he becomes more and more exhausted and stops thinking so clearly.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, the interesting thing to me, at least, is that while he has this internal awareness and he knows these things, it doesn't alter his behavior. He's just aware of the excuses he's making. Like, mm-hmm. it's not like knowing that he's misremembering this scene with Litchfield or knowing that even if Litchfield had caught the tumor right away, it would have been too late, is making him forgive Litchfield or making him go to Litchfield to check out his insomnia. Like, none of these things are changing his action. So it's like this internal awareness that doesn't result in any kind of internal change. And that's because of his innate stubbornness that he knows these things, but he's not going to act on them.
That's true, which also feels very realistic, actually.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think like most people, when they're behaving ridiculously or doing something wrong, on some level they know it. Yeah. And they just don't, like, they know it and can maybe even admit it to themselves, but it's not enough to push change.
Right. Yes. I mean, it's a universal human experience to be like, look, man, look, self, here are the 6 reasons why you shouldn't do this. And then you're like actively doing it as you're thinking that to yourself. So,
definitely.
Yeah.
We also learned that Ralph is also like working himself to near death in his garden just about every day. He's going out into his garden every day and picking weeds like crazy, working himself to death. So he's not walking like he used to when his wife was sick, but he is doing things that he can distract himself. I think the other thing is that like we see he's lonely. He's very lonely, and he doesn't want to say the word depression. It's like he calls it the D word. He can't handle that diagnosis because he's an old man that's stuck in his ways, and the idea of having like a mental health issue can't deal with it. But he can just call it loneliness and have it just be that. But basically what we're saying here is beyond just the insomnia, Ralph is a man who seems very not well at the beginning of the story.
Yeah, the idea of him not wanting to name it depression, it hits hard. I think it's a pretty relatable thought, actually.
Yeah, because like it's like admitting to yourself that you're depressed is a big deal, because that's a big diagnosis. That's just, like, that's serious.
It's sort of especially if you're of the frame of mind of a 70-year-old man in the mid 90s, you're like in his point, from his point of view, it's like a kind of admission of failure or admission of weakness. Now, I think we've, as a society, maybe changed our attitude about that a bit, but I think it's very easy to see why he feels that way about it.
For sure. Ralph does try to start walking again to cure his insomnia, and that's kind of where the actual action and plot of the book starts moving forward, because on his way to the bookstore, he sees a poster in the window of a clothing store with a picture of a woman on it, and it says, "Wanted for murder, Susan Edwina Day." Hey, Susan Day. So Matt, we learned that Susan Day is a feminist who a group of Derry residents is trying to get coming to the town and speak in support of the woman care clinic after it was almost firebombed last year. So we immediately see a line being drawn amongst members of the town here over abortion. So yes, Matt, a large part of the conflict in this book is going to circle around the pro-life, pro-choice debate. So Stephen King's really just kind of fucking going for it here. He's just kind of jumping into the deep end with the stuff.
Right, what you're passionate about, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth talking about, like, maybe why. I mean, we can't know for sure because we haven't gotten to all the themes yet, but like I hinted at in the kind of setting the stage for what 1994 was like, I think there was, I mean, obviously there's been very passionate arguments about abortion, since before Roe v. Wade, but I think the very early 90s, like there were several Supreme Court cases in a row around women's healthcare clinics and protecting the rights of people to enter those clinics, and the demonstrations going on and violence happening, and there was a lot of stuff happening. And it's not that it stopped happening, but I feel like the early 90s there was an uptick in some of this stuff, and so you just feel like maybe it was on King's mind. He like read it in a newspaper and thought, that would be a great thing to introduce into my story and explore a little bit here.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think is a braver man than I am to kind of wade into a conflict that has just very strong opinions on all sides. Yeah.
I mean, I think this is, I think that, but again, I remember like the key thing about Stephen King is like, I literally don't think that he has an ability to stop himself.
Sure.
like he almost, if he sees a raw nerve, he's going to poke it. Like that's the kind of storyteller that he is, actually. Yeah. It doesn't surprise me at all that, like, okay, he sees that people are acting particularly crazy in the news, and he's like, oh, that's great material.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that his protagonist here, like Stephen King is pretty liberal. He's always been so. I don't know. I don't have a quote in front of me saying whether he is like picked a side of this debate, but I feel pretty confident in saying Stephen King is pro-choice. But he makes his character like not a mouthpiece to speak his politics. He makes him a person that seems pretty not entirely indifferent to abortion, but like uncertain about this whole thing. Like, yeah. I love this part right here. Yeah, they perform abortions, Ham said. You got a problem with that? Ralph thought of all the years he and Kerrigan had tried to have a baby, years that had produced nothing but several false alarms and a single messy 5-month miscarriage, and shrugged. Suddenly the day seemed too hot and his legs too tired. The thought of his return journey, the up Mile Hill leg in particular, hung in the back of his mind like something strung from a line of fishhooks. Christ, I don't know, he said. I just wish people didn't have to get so shrill.
Yeah. Ralph's reaction is again very human and relatable. I mean,
sure.
I think being conflicted about, what is a very complex issue is natural and relatable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that his tiredness in general reflects his tiredness of this kind of debate, that he doesn't seem to like and he's not the type of person that's had skin in this game. So he's not particularly on one side or the other in this whole thing. I think if you asked him, he'd probably say, I personally don't care for it. He's a 70-year-old man. I don't think he's going to be he's probably not super progressive in his politics, especially his social politics.
Right.
But whether or not he thinks it should be legal, or if he's going to be pro-life, he just hasn't ever had to come to a side in this thing.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I mean, unfortunately, we're inevitably moving through some ground that is fraught with raw nerves,
sure,
kind of all over the place, because I in real life, I've encountered the phenomenon of people who had a lot of trouble conceiving, and the emotions that surround being in that situation are, very overwhelming. In the negative direction for a lot of people. And so the idea of abortion when you're in that situation can be just this, it can feel emotionally like a stab in the heart, even though in a certain sense it's this has nothing to do with you actually, but it's okay, but we're talking by definition about people who are sort of in extremis. So it's it's just a difficult thing for people to talk about rationally. And you can understand why there's a lot of shrillness as Ralph puts it.
Yeah, definitely. And it's why I have this very distinct memory of reading, and I only remember when I read this book. I just have a very distinct memory of reading this book and getting to this part and going, oh, Steven, you're going here. Okay. And get a little sweaty because, I mean, you're right. This is a very fraught topic. It's a very emotional topic. We'll see where he's going with it, right? We don't know enough to know, well, why is this in this book? What are you trying to say? What are we doing here? But I do think it's interesting that at the start of this whole thing, our protagonist's opinion on this thing is not exactly fully formed. But at the end of the day, he does sign the petition, right? He signs the petition not because he particularly wants to, but because he knows it's what Kerrigan would have done. And I love this part right here. Kerrigan would have signed his damn petition, he thought. She was no fan of abortion, but she was also no fan of men coming home after the bars closing and mistaking their wives and kids for soccer balls. True enough, but that wouldn't have been her main reason for signing. She would have done it on the off chance that she might get to hear an authentic firebrand like Susan Day up close and in person. She would have done it after the ingrained curiosity which had perhaps been her dominating characteristic. Something so strong not even the brain tumor had been able to kill it. 2 days before she died, she had pulled the movie ticket he'd been using as a bookmark out of the paperback novel he'd left on the bedside table because she had wanted to know what he had seen. It had been A Few Good Men, as a matter of fact, and he was both surprised and dismayed to discover how much it hurt to remember that. Even now, it hurt like hell.
Yeah, that's great.
The specificity of that memory is incredible. And I think this is one of King's greatest skills of many, many we've talked about here, but just to transition from this, he unsure of what to do about this important social issue. Fine, I'll sign the petition. I'll do it because Kerrigan, but why? Is it because she was pro-choice? Not necessarily. But it's because she would have wanted to see this thing, which reminds me of her curiosity, which leads me down this rabbit hole of a memory of specific moment, of just the specificity of she picked up my book and looked at the ticket in my paperback. Like, I love it. I love it. I love it because I, of course, used before we stopped having movie tickets, but I used movie tickets as bookmarks all the time. And I think everybody did. And so, like, not only is the memory specific to their relationship, but it's also relatable to everyone else.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny how, every once in a while I'll find an old movie ticket that I like saved because it was some specific, special event, and it'll immediately trigger this wave of memory in me. It's actually kind of a shame that we don't really do that anymore. Yeah, it's funny because I was going to make a quip about how I was surprised that Ralph hadn't been going to see The Shawshank Redemption. But actually, I think the fact is that, like, the bit that you just read, like, it's a serious, somber, sad, emotional bit. Like, it actually would have thrown off the tone of the of what King was going for if he had, like, thrown in a little tongue-in-cheek Dark Tower multiverse reference in there.
Sure.
Yeah, it makes more sense that it would be like, just some other movie.
Yeah, but I still love, like, the fact that the movie's named, right? It had been A Few Good Men, as a matter of fact. Like, because it mattered to her what the movie was, he remembers specifically what the movie was. Like, that just feels like a memory that he's going to remember for the rest of his life. Yeah. And it's not because he has particularly fond memories of A Few Good Men, despite how good of a movie it is. It's because of this moment and this memory. And I love, like, specific sometimes works. And it really does here. Yeah.
And, nothing is ever accidental in novels, right? So, like, A Few Good Men is a novel that's about, A Few Good Men is a movie that's about justice. Mm-hmm. He didn't say that he went to see The Mask, right? like he went to see A Few Good Men, a movie about justice. Mm-hmm. So that's important, right? Like that like we're associating that with this character in this story.
Sure. Yeah. So, yeah. All right. So on his way back home from the store, Ralph is climbing up Mile Hill when he suddenly gets, like, super dizzy and almost passes out. Because we have to remember, Matt, he's really fucking tired. He's had insomnia for months. Like, I think this is one thing that might be hurt by the method with which we're reading this book, the slow kind of only a certain few chapters a week type thing, that this is the start of the book and Ralph's already fucking exhausted. And as it's been explained to us, it's only going to get worse from here. So we need to keep in our mind everything he's doing here. He's fucking wiped. He's exhausted. He's barely awake, but he still can't sleep.
Yeah. Right. But, like, mentally and physically, and just awful. Yeah.
But it just so happens that his neighbor, Lois Chass, I don't actually know how to pronounce that. They say the E?
I feel like it was Chassis, but I don't really remember. I'll try to pay attention next time.
I'm going to say Chassis, and it'll be a loop situation.
Okay.
Lois Chassis is sitting on a park bench and watches him almost pass out. And this here's an introduction of a new character here, Matt. And we see immediately here that Lois has the fucking hots for Ralph, and Ralph clearly likes her in some ways too. I love this description here. Lois Chassis had large, dark eyes, the kind that had been called Spanish eyes when Ralph was a kid. And he bet they had danced through the minds of dozens of boys during Lois's high school years. They were still her best feature, but Ralph didn't much care for the worry he saw in them now. It was, what? A little too neighborly for comfort was the first thought to occur to him, but he wasn't sure it was the right thought.
Yeah.
So they dig each other.
They do. He does indeed have the hots for her, as you say. But as with many things concerning Ralph, it's a complicated, layered, contradictory brand of the hots, which kind of makes it not quite the hots anymore, I think.
I guess that's how strictly you're defining the hots, whether it's the hots or not the hots.
I think to the extent that my attempt at a joke has a point, it's like Ralph is not a character who is ruled by strong passions. He is slowing down, right? So he definitely has feelings for this woman, but also there's like 18 other things going on in his head that muddy it up and make it not like he's not just gonna hop into bed with her, obviously.
Sure. What I do love most about this introduction of Lois here, Matt, though, is we kind of immediately see how what the dynamic between the two of them is and will be. Ralph, up until this point in the story, has demonstrated himself to be a person who's very good at like avoiding dealing with the shit that's happening to him, you know, the insomnia, his depression, his grief. And we meet Lois and this person with these piercing Spanish eyes of hers is able to see him and immediately calling him out on the ways he's deflecting, right? Like he's like, yeah, I'm fine. I just taking a break. And she's, oh, just a break. Yeah. Like, is that why you let that piece of litter go? She just sees him and sees what's going on with him in a way that nobody else seems to.
Yeah. I actually feel like there's a minor theme in this book so far of nobody noticing each other's struggles. And I don't have a ton of evidence for that, actually. Like, in fact, I'm having trouble really calling it to mind at all right now. But I remember at some point while reading it being like, nobody, obviously except Lois, really notices how much of a struggle Ralph is going through. Like, he's interacting with all these people, and they basically think he's fine, you know, but he's dealing with insomnia and grief. And they're just like, hey, Ralph, how's it going, bud? And then I don't know, I don't remember what it was exactly, but I felt like there were hints that maybe other things were going on in other people's lives. Oh, it's the bruises on well, not just that, but the bruises on Helen's leg that he like didn't notice until later. That was the thing that jumped out to me as like, okay, nobody's noticing what's wrong with him, and he's not noticing what's wrong with other people, and it's like a kind of a mutual lack of you know, noticing other people's struggles. Yeah,
like people are kind of blind to the struggles of everyone around them. In very specific kind of ways. Yeah, I like that. So like I said, he says he's absolutely fine, and she kind of calls him on his bullshit. And I love this part, this right here. I know, he said, but I'm really all right, he meant to finish. And then he looked up from his hands, looked into her dark eyes again, and what he saw there made it impossible to finish for a moment. There was a weary sadness in her eyes. Or was it loneliness? Maybe both. In any case, those were not the only things he saw in them. He also saw himself. Which is just a wonderful moment, right? Obviously, we see that there's something wrong with Lois as well. That it's not just his silent suffering. Something's going on inside her as well, and he's kind of clued into it. But again, I guess he does do something. He invites her to come hang out later in the day, so that him taking action there. But I also love like the poetic nature of like he sees himself in those eyes. So he sees sadness and loneliness in her eyes, and he can't say those things about himself, but he can say, I see a reflection of me in her eyes. As a way of like roundabout declaring that, yes, I too am sad and lonely.
Yes, I'm suffering terribly. I can only admit that because I'm going to accuse her. Yeah. I like that. Yeah. And it seems like, you know, we're meeting a key member of our quartet here. So.
Yeah. I think that's fair to say at this point, at least. So after they quickly look at young children playing baseball in the park and yearning for younger days, although I love in Ralph's exhaustedness right now, he looks at kids playing baseball and he's like, that just looks tiring.
Yeah.
It's just like the idea of tiring and exhaustion are just like dripping in the writing in this book. Like everything, like he's feeling this exhaustion that's making him look at everything he sees from the perspective of a person who's really tired.
Yeah, right. Just like, you know, focusing on the fact that it seems like they're going to injure themselves and that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
All right, now we work our way into the next chapter, and our final chapter of the week, chapter 2, and perhaps spurred on by his conversation with Lois, Ralph finally makes an appointment to see the doctor about his insomnia, Mr. Litchfield, and then spurred on by himself being an idiot, he immediately cancels it after. Uh-huh. I love the detail of that. Like he calls him up, makes the appointment, and then like waits 10 minutes and says, "Oh, shoot, I forgot I had a podiatrist appointment at that same time."
Yeah.
Oh, well, we can do. No, you know what? I'll call you.
Yeah.
It's just so. It's so passive. Like he can't even just. He has to make up a lie. He can't even just say, "I'd like to cancel my appointment." Like I don't know. It's really fascinating to me.
Yeah, we've all been there.
I know. It's like, I swear to God, I think when I quit cable, I'm always like, I found somebody else.
Uh-huh.
And they're like, oh, really? who? And then I'm lying, and I just don't know what to do. I'm trapped now.
Yeah.
What? I just don't want cable anymore.
I've learned recently that if people come to your door, you just tell them that you're not the homeowner of the house, and they'll
you just say I'm renting. Yeah.
I'm like, oh, okay, never mind.
I want to quit the gym.
Yeah, I just
that's a Friends reference.
Okay, yeah. This is gonna slip out of my head if I don't say it now, even though it's not connected to what we're talking about. But
okay.
Ralph goes on these long I do need to finish that sentence? I mean, that's the thing that King does, right?
Oh,
and then he gets hit by a van. So, I mean, that's not an intentional Dark Tower connection, obviously, but kind of ends up being a Dark Tower connection.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just King, especially, I think at this point he's taking long walks already at this point in his life.
Right.
And so I think he's just writing a character that does the same thing he does, for sure.
It's a good habit.
Yeah. But despite lying to his doctor, Ralph is at least being honest about something. What's happening to him is getting really bad. He starts being unable to make decisions because his mind is so cloudy that he can't handle the concept of making decisions. His short-term memory is also getting messed up. And then we get this part here, right here. The color had started draining out of things. The world had begun to take on a dull, grainy quality of a newspaper photograph. So things are getting bad for old Ralph.
Yeah, right. This begins to emphasize that like this has ceased to be just like, oh, this is annoying, and it's becoming like he's debilitated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And he decides to go back to the library and read some more books about insomnia. He gets a brilliant plan from one of those books. Going to bed early, not working. What about going to bed later? That's the ticket. If you go to bed really late, then you'll be sure to sleep through the night. That's going to definitely work, right? Right?
Yeah, definitely. I can definitely not imagine any way that's going to backfire.
As a general side note here in this portion of the book, I really appreciated this section of the book, this idea that, like, he says the more people he interact with, the more he realized that every single person had their own personal remedy for insomnia or sleeplessness. Like, everyone he talks to is like, oh yeah, take a shot of whiskey or listen to music right before you go to bed. And Ralph is desperate enough to just keep trying them all. And this will be something, spoilers, I guess, technically, is not the last time someone is going to offer him some home remedy for insomnia that he's going to go ahead and give a try.
Yeah, it's kind of unreasonably fun to watch Ralph think through the process of experimentation and problem solving and trying these different remedies. I think there's a big part of me actually that reads books specifically for this sort of like careful, methodical problem solving vicariously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
I don't know if you feel that way, but I get a lot of joy out of that aspect of, reading novels.
I do too. I mean, there's like 1,000 different reasons why I like reading books, but that is definitely one of them. Seeing people solve problems in a meticulous kind of way is very fun.
Yeah.
So his first attempt at staying up late goes really bad. It's like me with my wife every time I try to make her watch a movie, and she just falls asleep in the chair immediately before 11 p.m. But on his second attempt, he managed to stay up all the way till 3 a.m., getting increasingly more and more tired until this happens. Shortly after 3 o'clock, that pleasant drowsiness began to disappear. It did not go with a champagne cork pop, but rather seemed to ooze away, like sand through a fine sieve or water down a partially clogged drain. When Ralph realized what was happening, it wasn't panic he felt, but sick dismay. So, Matt, here's where I ask you what you think about this insomnia specifically. We are in a Stephen King novel that does connect to the Dark Tower. Is there something more going on with this insomnia than just your run-of-the-mill sleeplessness?
I mean, of course there is, unless I'm wrong this time. In fact, my first thought was sleep vampire. And then I hear you say, what the hell is that? And I don't know. But it's clear that his body and his mind are going to keep waking up earlier and earlier until the wake up time falls before the getting sleepy time, and then he can't sleep at all. And then what? Does he just die? Does he go crazy? What's causing this? Who's causing this? Is this happening to other people? Are other weird things happening to other people? More questions than answers at this point. And, we're just barely into the book, so that's fine. I don't think that I seriously mean sleep vampire when I say that. I think that's just because we just read Salem's Lot, and so I'm thinking a lot about vampires. But
I like the idea that every season 2 book is going to have a vampire of some sort in it.
Yeah.
We got your sleep vampire. We got your dragon vampire.
Yeah. We're going to have a fear vampire at some point. I know that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We definitely got on the stand. It'll be a virus vampire.
Virus vampire.
It's all...
Yeah.
Regardless of where this insomnia is coming from, Ralph is unable to get back to sleep, which means this day he will have slept none at all.
Mm-hmm.
Which is kind of, as the book says, a preview of what is to come if things don't change. He goes out into his living room, sits in his chair, and looks out at his town as it wakes up. He sees Rosalie, the homeless dog, limping down the street looking for food, the paper boy, the usual small town stuff. It just a man kind of sitting in a chair, resigned to just a full day of no sleep.
Yep. I don't know how many times you've had a whole night with zero sleep. I've probably done it a handful of times. And it always fucking sucks. Like, it's funny because when you're young, it always sounds like it's going to be a fun adventure to try. And then you always forget how much it sucks every time you try it. And then you get older and you're just like, no, fuck that. It's more like voluntarily giving yourself the flu for a couple of days than it is doing anything fun at all. Anyway, sure hope nothing bad happens on this day that would require Ralph to be thinking clearly.
Yeah, I mean, I have not pulled an all-nighter in a very long time, but of course, when I was younger, I used to do it all the time. And yeah, even when you're young, it sucks. The thing that I found is you make it to about noon, and you're doing okay.
Uh-huh.
If you make it through the night and you get to sunrise, you make it till about noon, and you're doing okay. And then like the early afternoon hits, and you're just fucking destroyed.
Uh-huh.
And if you don't go to bed, it's just you're dead. You're just dead. You can't function anymore.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's when I was in my 20s. So like, imagine being 70 fucking years old and having to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Having to deal with, dramatic and stressful things. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So speaking of bad decisions during days of sleeplessness, or maybe not bad decisions, we don't know. The day after this moment gets complicated. After trying to nap a couple times, Ralph goes to make some soup, but forgot that he ate the last of his soup yesterday, or at least he can't find the final cup of noodles that he's supposed to have. And so he has to go buy a new one. I love this quote here. He pushed cans and bottles around in aimless fashion, then simply stared into the cupboard for a while, as if expecting the box of soup packets to magically appear in the space he had made. When they didn't, he repeated the process, only this time moving things back to their original positions before starting again, with the look of distant perplexity, which was becoming, Ralph mercifully did not know this, his dominant expression. I love this whole thing, because like this idea of like, your brain is not working right, and so you're confused, and so you're just like the idea of putting everything back in its place and then moving it all again just to be like, all right, but this time it just seems like just the thing a confused, tired brain would do.
Absolutely. And it makes you feel a bit more, I think, pity for Ralph.
Sure.
Especially because like you pointed out, we take this little slightly more distant narration bit.
Yeah, the little parenthetical there.
Noticing like, oh, he's, you see him from the outside, you can see how bad he really is.
Yeah. That is one of the moments where the narrator kind of breaks, and we zoom out a little bit more. So we've kind of we've given our readers information that Ralph doesn't quite have yet, which so far, everything Ralph has known, we've known.
Yeah.
And so King does this a few times. This is a very King thing to do. Like, he likes to stay really tight and close with his protagonists, but occasionally he'll just interject and remove us from them just a little bit here.
Yeah. Little did Ralph know he would never have that cup of noodles again. I wanted to just point out that it's sort of Ka that he's out of noodles, because then he has to go to the store, and then he has to, just at the right time, basically, to witness the horribly beaten Helen come down the street. So that's Ka, obviously. Yeah. He says, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly, when it comes to Deep Now, he certainly seems to be in the right and or wrong place at the right and or wrong time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, part of me wants to be like, was this arranged? Did someone steal his chicken soup? I don't know, man. I think it's enough to just say that it does seem like the universe is arranging things so that some kind of confrontation between him and Deep Now is orchestrated.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely get why you feel that way from these chapters for sure. It just seems like coincidence is happening quite a bit.
Right.
So I loved this. I loved this part here as well. Just speaking of Ralph's mindset as he's kind of half asleep. He stepped into the bathroom, combed his hair, and then went downstairs. Here's Audie Murphy, heading out into enemy territory in search of supplies, he thought. Primary target, 1 box of Lipton chicken and rice cup of soup packets. If locating and securing this target should prove impossible, I'll divert to my secondary, noodles and beef. I know that's a risky mission, but I work best alone, he finished as he came out on the porch. Old Mrs. Perrin happened to be passing, and she favored Ralph with a sharp look, but said nothing. So he's like talking to himself now and like going through this long, complex Audie Murphy thing based on the movies he was watching, and then breaking from internal thoughts to actual external dialogue. It's just perfect.
I mean, he may have, I think one way you can read this is that maybe he was talking to himself out loud the whole time, and it only became evident because there was someone to hear him and react to it.
Yeah, it certainly seems so. Yeah,
because I feel like he has been shown to talk to himself a couple times, and I think it's entirely possible that he's just constantly talking to himself and doesn't realize it. And I think it's also possible that he's doing it more and more the more sleep deprived he gets. Like, I think that's pretty clear, actually. Just isn't it kind of funny that he keeps running into people who he thinks of as like old Mrs. Perrin? It's like, okay, you're 70, so like you're just surrounded by all these like really, really old people.
They're technically older than him, Matt, and therefore they're old.
Yeah, right.
So Ralph crosses the street and enters the Red Apple, searching for his chicken and noodle soup packets, and this is where the plot finds him. After he talks to himself for a little bit more, and the owner of the store starts chastising him for talking to himself, which is great. Enters the store, incredibly beat up Helen Deep Now. And I'm not going to read it all because it's just a disturbing description of what she looks like, but I love this piece here. More frightening than the way she looked was the way she was handling Natalie. She had the squalling, frightened baby slung casually on one hip, carrying her as she might have carried her books to high school 10 or 12 years before. So like she's barely conscious, right? And she's picked up her daughter and she's holding her daughter like very precariously, like because she's having trouble standing on her own. It's just really disturbing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so domestic abuse is now another thing that we're 2 for 2 on in season 2 books, Matt. And it is true that Stephen King writes about husbands or boyfriends or significant others, whatever, that beat their wives or partners a lot. He writes about this a lot. This is something that Stephen King returns to quite a bit. And I've read some, extremely, in my mind, uncharitable takes that say he's got a fetish for it. Like we joked earlier in the show about, Tabitha King reading his books and saying, "You trying to tell me something?" I think, and this is my opinion, but I think that's just wrong. I think domestic abuse and violence against partners in general is a thing that horrifies Stephen King. And I think he writes about the things that scare him in an attempt to understand it. And like this attempt of why would a person do this thing to another person? That kind of thing. Stephen King explores evil. That's what he does. And this is one of the most evil things in the world to his mind, this kind of violence to people. And so this is why he keeps returning to it, because he's afraid of it. He's horrified by it, and he wants to understand it. And so here it is again. And poor Helen Deep Now, horribly abused by her husband.
Yeah. I think you're right. I mean, Ralph, maybe kind of channeling Stephen King a bit, has difficulty even picturing Ed, this guy who he, likes, doing something like this. I think it's actually common among, decent people to have a hard time imagining the dark sides of their friends and neighbors. I think it's something that I have trouble understanding. Like I just tend to just assume that people can't do that sort of thing, and it takes quite a it's always quite a shock to learn that someone that I know has some kind of dark streak in them, because it's like, oh my God, like it almost feels supernatural, even though it's, you know, a thing that happens all the time, actually.
Sure. I mean, armed with this information about Ed, it makes the shock at seeing the man that he saw back out on the airport road, like, all the more disturbing, right? Because it's like Ralph can't even imagine that this is that a person like Ed would look like this. And no, obviously he is, and it was not an isolated incident, because here we are again.
Well, and it's interesting that incident happened, and he seems to have like so totally swept it under the rug mentally. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously so much other shit was going on with him. He lost his wife, and he's really struggling in a lot of ways, but it's just interesting that he just literally it seems like he literally didn't even think about that again after it happened. And I think that's not that uncommon, that like when something really sort of shockingly out of scope happens, a fairly normal reaction is to just like not want to think about it.
File it away as a one-off thing and forget about it. Right. I mean, I think textually the book says he did exactly that, and it's not even really right away that he remembers Ed and that incident. It is only until Helen brings up the why of this happening that he remembers what went down by the Derry airport. Yeah,
right.
I do really like, so Ralph rushes to help both Natalie and Helen. Another moment of, I guess you could call it gunslingerness, where nobody else does anything and Ralph rushes. Like the owner of the shop is like screaming she's going to drop the baby, and yet the book says does not take a step to do anything to help. But Ralph, the old 70-year-old man, like rushes over there and gets there just in time to hold up Helen and make sure Natalie doesn't fall on the ground. And great moment. I do love this little detail of recollection here, where we have Ralph suddenly remembered something else about yesterday. Helen had been wearing blue shorts, cut quite high, and had noticed a couple of bruises on her legs, a large yellow blotch far up on her left thigh, a fresher, darker smudge on the right calf. So, I mean, this is something that it's not saying he saw this and noted it yesterday and then just forgot about it. And so it's like, he doesn't quite say directly, I should have noticed this happening before, but he also kind of says it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's implied for sure.
And of course, this goes into the problem of the insomnia, right? This goes into his short-term memory loss, his inability to focus, his inability to make decisions. Like, you notice something, but you process the thing you're noticing. Not quite happening.
Right.
And to your earlier point about this kind of theme that we've had so far of people failing to notice the problems of other people, for sure is here. I think you're right.
Yep.
So Helen admits that it was Ed that did this to her, but she really, really doesn't want Ralph to call the police. And this is, I think, the first big choice that our protagonist makes in this book. I think the general rule, if you're reading a book and like if you want to analyze a book on any level, pay attention to the moments in which a character is given a choice, because those are the things in which the narrative usually hinges on. And of course, this is one of them, right? This is one of these story-defining choices. She says, Ralph, do not call the police. And what does Ralph do? He does it. He calls the police. Before we talk about that, though, I want to read this part, because I think this is really interesting. Please, Ralph, she replied. Only it came out as peas, Ralph, through her swollen lips. Don't call anybody. Ralph looked at her uncertainly. He had seen a lot of women wearing a lot of bruises over the course of his life, and a couple, although not many in all honesty, who had been beaten much more severely than Helen. It hadn't always seemed this grim, though. His mind and morals had been formed at a time when people believed that what went on between a husband and a wife behind closed doors of their marriage was their business, and that included the man who hit with his fists and the woman who cut with a tongue. You couldn't make people behave, and meddling in their affairs, even with the best intentions, all too often turned friends into enemies. So, I mean, this is a remarkably honest moment that Stephen King allows his character to have. And like, you know, we spoke about the one thing that he says on writing is you have to be true to your characters, right? And he's made this character who is a 70-year-old man in 1993. And I think it's just honest to admit that this character probably does not have a very progressive look on domestic violence, right? And does that make the character look good No, it doesn't. But it's honest how he would feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, but he still calls, right? That's the thing is he has these two. It's not the point. I think here is that it's not a slam dunk. Obviously, I should call the cops. It's an ambiguous, like, well, like, is it really my place? You know, she's asking me not to. She's probably not wrong that this is gonna, mess up her life in the short term in a way that's going to be really distressing for her.
Oh yeah, I mean, like her speech about like I don't have a job, I don't have any money. Right. Like he has like, what am I gonna do? Where am I gonna go?
Yeah,
it's terrifying.
I mean, even the early '90s were not a time where it was super, just kind of normal to get divorced with a baby and so forth. And so, his vacillating on this for a second is totally understandable. But yeah, like you said, he does make the call.
And doesn't it strike you like he had seen a lot of women wearing a lot of bruises over the course of his life, and a couple, although not many in all honesty, who had been beaten much more severely than Helen. Doesn't that make you wonder, like, Ralph, who the fuck are you hanging out with? Like,
yeah. Well, it's a thing that's popped up a few times where you're like, wait a second, who is this guy actually? like, well, I don't really know. We don't really know who Ralph is actually. We know what's happening within the time frame of him being 70 years old and so forth. But like, he seems extremely like resourceful and he takes initiative, he takes leadership. People like him, so it's like, wait, like what was this guy before he was an old man? We don't really think of we
know he worked for a printer. He worked in a printing place. So
yeah, I remember that, but that's pretty low res.
Yeah, sure. I'm just not like he wasn't like a secret.
He's not
CIA.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Like I don't know. I think it says much more about the town and the time than it necessarily does that, like, for Ralph, this kind of abuse is just much more commonplace in his time than like I am very happy to say I have never noticed like bruises on my friends' wives that I was like, oh, that's their business. Like, I'm very fortunate that I've never noticed that. And I know it's certainly, I'm not saying it doesn't exist anymore. I'm certainly not saying that, but just like he had seen a lot of women wearing a lot of bruises over the course of his life. Like, I certainly hope that by the time I'm 70, I could say that I have not seen a lot of women wear a lot of bruises over the course of my life.
Yeah. Especially not in your like town, in your like immediate social circle.
Sure.
I mean, I think it's worth doing a little exercise of just, noticing that somebody who's 70 in the early 90s was born in the early 20s.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's like, yeah, that's where we're anchoring ourselves in terms of American history.
But as you said, he does decide to call the police. And yeah, I mean, it's really unclear. I would like to say that this is the right thing to do. From my perspective, like, this guy did a terrible thing and he needs to be prevented from doing it again. But Carolyn is furious about it and distraught about it. Or not Carolyn, Helen.
Yeah.
Carol. Yeah. And I love the kind of what finally gets him over the hump in this is because of Kerrigan. Like, we've seen he's made two big decisions, or we can call big. The first decision is he signed the petition. The second decision is he decides to call the police. And both these decisions kind of spurred on by memories of Kerrigan. Right. I think that's important.
Yeah. Right. I agree.
So Helen, of course, is extremely, extremely mad at Ralph, but she does tell him why Ed did it. She put her name on the same petition that Ralph had put his name on, the one that brings Susan Day to Derry. And so this is when the book draws that connection for us that we've been talking about all episode, the connection between Ed's violent behavior of last year and Ed's violent behavior today. And so once again, dealing with this Susan Day lady.
Yeah. It's so interesting, right? Like, it seems like Ed has some kind of trigger in his brain that makes him just turn into a psycho whenever like certain ideas or situations come up. I don't know. Like, I guess it's fun for people to listen to me just talk bullshit, trying to find the answer, right? So
Yeah,
like
let's go for it.
my stab would be like King is doing the sort of like fictional trope exaggeration version of wife beaters are men who have two sides of their personality. I've actually met, some people like this where it's there's clearly some break in their brain somewhere where they actually kind of have two sides. But he's doing it in like the supernatural Stephen King way, where it's like, okay, this is a supernaturally caused personality schism. There's some evil thing coming in from outside Ed, making him go just psychotic whenever these sensitive points are triggered. And there's some will behind this. There's some purpose behind this. What's funny is that could all be totally wrong, and this could all be completely natural. Like this could actually be a story with no supernatural elements so far. We've seen nothing supernatural happen. We've got a brain tumor, we've got a man who has insomnia, and we've got a wife beater.
Yeah.
So it's just I'm literally just basing all of this off of the idea that it's Stephen King and crazy shit happens in Stephen King novels. So
sure, but definitely not all of them. I mean,
Shawshank.
I've just read a novel in which there's really no supernatural stuff at all. So it's true, but I think I like your theory. I like where your head's at with that. This idea of the classic genre fiction taking the reality and using the conceit of genre stuff to literalize it in a fun way. It does feel like sometimes these people that abuse their partners have a switch or a mask that they put on to become a different person. And the idea that this is literalizing that in a fun way. Fun relative term, right? Not fun like it's fun to see a man beat his wife, but fun and interesting to explore.
Making it a bit more palatable for us to think about because it's fiction and because it's fantasy and so forth. Yes.
And also kind of goes back to King's the question or the thought I posed a few minutes ago that like King writes about this stuff because he wants to understand it. And so maybe part of the entire conceit of the Ed character and what's happening to him is an idea for King to explore. Why would a person do that to another person? Maybe there is some evil force working on him, or maybe there is not, and it's all just him, and that's just the way people are.
Right.
And so, we'll continue to talk about that as we go. But this is kind of where we leave off because Ralph remembers what Ed was like last time this whole thing came up. And so he knows exactly what type of person he is right now, and knows that this wasn't an isolated incident. So he decides to go out there and have a conversation with Ed deep now. And despite being 70 years old and running on 0 hours of sleep, that is exactly what Ralph goes to do.
Probably ill-advised.
Yeah. And that's where this week's reading ends off, with him marching towards the Deep Now house to confront Ed. So we'll have to figure out next week how that confrontation goes. And that's it for this week's reading. Oh man, some really good chapters, Matt. I'm very excited about the rest of this book.
Me too. This is one of those weeks where as soon as we get off of the podcast, I'm just going to go start listening.
Awesome. All right. So we did not have a discussion question from last week because it was our movie episode, but we do have one for this week. And I think this one relates to this week's topic pretty good. So everyone out there has suffered from insomnia or sleeplessness at some point, right? So what is your personal remedy for a sleepless night? What do you do when you're having trouble getting to sleep? What's your trick? Let us know.
Yeah. And if it involves peanut butter,
yeah,
call me.
Maybe you do cover your body with peanut butter.
Yeah.
Folks, I don't know where Matt came up. Inside Baseball, when he first wrote it down, he put olive oil and then he changed it to peanut butter. And I don't know why he did that.
I mean, both of those sound terrible, but peanut butter sounded worse. So
peanut butter sounds way worse.
Yeah.
All right, folks, but that is going to do it for us this week. Next week, we'll be reading chapters 3 through 5 of Insomnia, 3 more chapters. I think this is going to be the longest section of the book. It's just kind of the way it shook out. I think this is 5 pages. So make sure you take a little bit, give yourself a little bit of extra time to read the chapters before next week's episode.
Yeah. Remember, you can reach us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter at kingslingerspod. And of course, the subreddit r/Doof Media is a great place to answer the discussion questions or just to hang out.
And don't forget to follow us on Instagram. That's Doof Media on Instagram. I honestly, I had totally forgotten. We record these episodes so long before the release day that sometimes I forget what I said, and I forgot that I told everyone to go bug my wife about a Stephen King book she should read. And I just got this text on Thursday morning, and it was like, why are all these people telling me to read books?
There were a lot of messages. So thank you very much, everyone.
Yes. Elisa had a lot of fun with it, though, because she took all of them and then she decided to make a poll to get people to vote on which one she should read. And I think she posted the final between the final 2 non-scary Stephen King books that she should read just today. And I think it's between 11/22/63 and Eyes of the Dragon. I think are the 2. So, and then the winner she's going to actually read.
That's super fun.
I don't actually know if I said, at least if when one of these wins, are you going to read it? And she goes, it's so long.
Tell her she has to.
I'll try to.
All right. Great.
All right. If you are not already subscribed to Kingslingers, we also strongly recommend you do that so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and pretty much anywhere else in the world you can listen to podcasts.
Yeah. And if you like any of our shows and you want to support them, then please consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/doofmedia. This week, special thanks to our new patrons, My Tallest, Diddley, and Larissa S. Welcome to the community, and we hope you enjoy the cool bonus podcasts and other fun reward stuff that we have over there on the Patreon, including Other Levels of the Tower, where we talk about Stephen King adaptations.
Oh, so much fun. I love recording those episodes.
Me too.
And thank you, all of you that are new this week, and everyone else. If you cannot afford to donate, that is, of course, okay. You can help us out by sharing the podcast. Bother other people on Instagram besides my wife. And you can always help us out by leaving us a rating and a review. This week's Spotlight review comes from Mordraka, who gives us 5 stars and says, a very welcome continuation. Having previously listened to We've Got Worm and its follow-up in Ward, I love the dynamic of these two just as much as the subject matter, and I loved getting exposure to tools to use and terms for tools I was already using in literary analysis as much as both of the others put together. I took a break, and coming back to this dynamic in Kingslingers was just a little bit like coming home. Coming home in a way I can read. I missed following along as these two have a really genuine, involved conversations about the minutest intricacies of a work of fiction more than I realized. The role reversals work out spectacularly if you were a fan of We've Got Worm. Matt's intellectualism serves him much better in the role of the one learning a work, and Scott's innate enthusiasm works just as much better in the role of the one who already knows each part. If you're coming in new, the back and forth nature of these personalities over the subject of a constantly engaging series of novels can give you plenty of new thoughts or just give you new appreciation for the thoughts you already had. And also, you should go listen to We've Got Worm if you're interested in Worm or superheroes or capital T trauma, because the polish they achieve in Kingslingers will only make going back, after all, harder. Mordraka, that was very, very, very nice. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. I actually kind of appreciate comparing and contrasting the work that we did in these two shows, because there's relatively few people who have really accompanied us all the way on both of them. So yeah, appreciate that.
I also love Matt's smart and Scott's enthusiastic, which I'm not even insulted about, because I'm like, yeah, that checks out, right?
Yeah. And I'm just like, look, this is just how my voice sounds, okay? It's really hard to make it do anything other than just kind of do this. Anyway.
That's very enthusiastic.
Well, but thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone who has taken the time to write those ratings and reviews. We really do appreciate it. But that's it for us this week. We will be right back here next week as we continue with Insomnia. It's exciting. There might be a fight that goes down next week, Matt. We don't know. Is a guy going to punch a 7-year-old man?
Well, maybe they'll just hug it out.
That's probably it. long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.